simply mass times velocity, and since the bullet's not going to lose much mass going through a melon, it's the velocity that counts. You're going to have an impact velocity, but you're going to have a residual velocity. The actual amount of momentum that's deposited is going to depend on how much the bullet slowed down as it goes through the target. Of course, it's going to slow a lot more going through a human head than it is through a melon. And we have empirical evidence for that because the Weapons Testing Branch, the U.S. Army, did an experiment for the Warren Commission in which it took a mock-up simulated human head. I'm sure volunteers were hard to find for this experiment. They took a human skull, filled it with ballistic gelatin, placed goat skin on the back to simulate the scalp. They used Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle. They used the same batch of ammunition that he had. They placed their shooter 90 yards away, the same distance that was from the book depository window to where the president was when he was killed. They measured the muzzle velocity of the bullet. They measured the impact velocity of the bullet and found that the skulls, they did 10 reps, and the simulated heads always went forward. I understand one time it kind of spun off to the side, which suggests the marksman was slightly off target, but no jet effect. The skulls moved approximately 1 mile per hour, which means about 50% of the momentum was deposited. In contrast, they also shot through a 15-centimeter thick piece of horse meat with no bone, and in that case, it slowed the bullet down from an impact of 1,900 feet per second to only 1,800 feet per second. So you're talking about a 5% deposition of the momentum in the case of the horse meat. And I would suggest that horse meat is harder to penetrate. You know, take a pencil and jam it into a piece of horse meat as opposed to a honeydew melon or a cantaloupe. So we're talking about an order of magnitude difference between the amount of momentum that would be deposited. In Alvarez's next work, of course, then the question would be, what if he had used a Mannlicher Carcano instead of a 30-06? And John Latimer answered that question for us. He tried to do it with melons and could not get a jet effect. And the reason is because with a 30-06, the other end of the equation, if you reduce the amount of momentum, if you work next on the kinetic energy, you'll notice in the equation that the velocity is an exponential function here, which means that if the bullet is going faster, the amount of energy deposited is going to increase exponentially as opposed to momentum, which increases linearly. So by speeding up your bullet, you're going to increase the energy to thrust from kinetic energy at a much faster rate than the momentum increases. And by using a 30-06 instead of a Mannlicher Carcano, if you used factory loads, which have around 27 to 3,000 feet per second velocity, as opposed to Mannlicher Carcano, which has only around 2,150 feet per second, you're increasing the thrust at a much faster rate, and that could explain why Alvarez got it to work, except Alvarez in a footnote tells us he didn't use factory loads, he used home loads, which suggests to me that Alvarez understood, as a Nobel Prize in physics, he probably knew the difference that velocity effect has over kinetic energy as opposed to momentum, and he probably also knew that target hardness is what determines how much momentum is deposited. So now on to the acoustical evidence. At the time President Kennedy was assassinated, the Dallas police were recording their broadcast, and a most unusual event occurred in that for about 5.5 minutes there was a motorcycle motor dominates the primary police channel. Somewhere in Dallas, a police officer's microphone on his radio had come stuck open, which occasioned this call from the dispatcher. Okay, I'm not sure I can get the arrow here. I'm going to need an arrow. There it is. So the question that is of interest is how is it that the dispatcher was so certain that the microphone was on a motorcycle that was on the Simmons Freeway. Well, the most likely clue was the fact that 1 minute earlier you can hear sirens in the background, and the dispatcher knew that the president was on his way to Parkland Hospital with the probably that was the one emergency going on at the moment, so it would make sense that the microphone must have been close enough to the motorcade that it could pick up those sirens, and therefore was probably on the Simmons Freeway. Also the fact that there were 18 motorcycles in the president's escort. So this led some conspiracy buffs to suggest, specifically I guess it was Mary Farrell and Gary Mack, that since the motorcycle noise covers the time of the assassination, that if the motorcycle was with the president's escort, and if it was in Dealey Plaza, and since it had its microphone open, it might have captured the sounds of the gunfire, and then we would have an answer to one of the abiding questions of the assassination, and that is how many gunshots were actually fired. And so the House Select Committee on Assassinations arranged for an acoustical analysis by an expert firm called Baranek and Newman, recommended to them by the Acoustical Society of America as the top laboratory in the U.S., mainly because they had worked on they had done the first forensic analysis of gunfire to locate a shooter, and that was the Kent State shooting. And the Kent State shooting, of course, the National Guard had killed several students